So one thing I forgot to mention, and I kind of get scatterbrained when I have to do a long video because I'm trying to rush through everything while fitting everything, was so I briefly mentioned the flex plate, right? So when I got this into the engine bay, there's a spec that you'll see with your torque converter to check um, your air gap or your gap. I called it play in the video, just meaning because when it's loose, that's what you're checking. But what it is it's the distance that the torque converter is allowed to travel um, toward the engine or toward the transmission. So that's why they call this a flex plate. Obviously, under load, this has the ability to move in and out a little bit. The thing I was worried about was you will find this flex plate for 302s, and it does mention it being, I don't even remember. It's very minimal. It's like a 16th of an inch thicker or something like that. It might be 3/16. But so what you do is once you have the bell housing mated up and everything, on an AOD in particular, you can get to it through the starter motor. But essentially what you're doing is you need to have the torque converter able to move back and forth off the pump. Like, I want to say it's like you don't want more than like an eighth of an inch. I'd have to look at my instructions again. See, everything in these last two videos is like, I don't remember anything, at least specific measurements, but that was how I set it up. And at first I was nervous because it seemed like it really had minimal play when I would move the torque converter forward, and I was like, oh no, like I hope that I had it seated all the way, because that's the thing when you're installing the torque converter, you have to do like a few turns, push it, and keep making sure. And the way you make it sure that it's seated is you take a straight edge or yardstick or something, anything you can get, and just make sure the torque converter is basically behind the bell housing. And what I had to actually do is, because at this point the engine's already in and the holes are aligned, and there's not quite enough play to get the studs to come out of the flex plate. That would be a bad thing if it had that much room. But when I cranked the engine over just a little bit, and that actually allowed me to, like, the torque converter did seat a little more. And then how I measured that gap was when I would push the torque converter forward, I took some masking tape, or excuse me, when it was pushed back toward the pump, I put masking tape around the studs, then I pushed it forward and I would measure the spots on the studs that didn't have tape. And really what I ended up doing was finding a washer that was around, 100 thousandths plus, or almost an eighth of an inch, and then I would put that against the metal. So I assumed it would be good to go. You have parts that are built for it, but I think I was worried again with this being a little bit thicker, but that is critical. With GMs, it's actually really nice and easy because they have those open bell housings, and all people do, like if there's too much gap, you just add washers or something, because what it's about is the contact area between the feet of the torque converter and where it's touching here. And then when that torque converter becomes one with the flex plate, that it becomes the flex plate pushing on the torque converter and vice versa. Because if you don't have that, and let's say you have a torque converter and it's not moving, what's going to happen is, if that torque converter comes forward, because that's the thing you have to keep in mind about the internal combustion dynamics, is the crank. The reason we check for crankshaft end play when you're building is because it wants to come out of the engine. Like, it'll go forward and back and so on. And what'll happen without that play is if it goes toward the engine, it can take your thrust bearing out, or your middle main bearing. And if it goes toward the transmission, what'll happen is it can take your transmission pump out of the front. So either way, not a good scenario. Like a transmission like mine has enough money in it, and the engine has enough money in it. I would say your engines typically are going to have more money to suffer catastrophic failure, but yeah. So that is something that, luckily they do put that in your torque converter instructions, and it's something that I feel like a lot of people might not consider or know about. But again, most of the time you're probably okay. Like the torque converter was built for that transmission. The flex plate is usually going to fit within that spec, but you definitely should make sure that it's moving, because it could even be a manufacturer defect or something like that. But again, how I checked it, moved it all the way back, moved the converter back, put some tape on the studs, looked through the starter motor hole. They gave me just enough. Now, the thing about this being thicker, though, when the torque converter is pulled back forward to be able to put your nuts on it, is that they were just about flush with the stud. Like any less, I wouldn't have felt comfortable. But those were ARP, use Loctite, so I think it's pretty much good to go. And then it was all torqued to the proper specifications. So, but yeah, just make sure you check that play, that you can move your torque converter in and out. And if it feels too short, give the engine a rotation. Maybe it's not fully seated. See if it'll move in and out more if you turn that a little. And if there's too much gap, then hopefully your studs will let you use washers. That's the only thing I'll say of Ford versus GM is like with the enclosed bell housing, versus how the GMs are, or manual transmission. Sometimes like you can take the whole bell housing is separate, but obviously then you're not worried about a torque converter anyway. But the GM it is a little easier to measure those gaps. Like you can actually take a stack of feeler gauges, but with AOD you have to do like a little trick with that. And but the masking tape technique, like that was awesome. And if you have a keen enough eye and a light, like you can clearly see where the tape isn't, and you can probably almost eyeball what 1/8 of an inch is or less. So anyway, that's all, but I thought I would share that as part of the fun of installation.